Christ and his leadership. And we asked the question, how is it exactly that saints lead? We had two ways. One, you develop your character and you exercise your gifts. We don't want us all to be thinking, oh, the only way I lead is to have a position, to be asked to coordinate this or run this program or ministry. Your leadership begins with strong character, which is thus your righteous influence, and then the exercise of your gifts, where you model being useful as designed by the Holy Spirit. Well, then we studied Leadership 102, which was primarily a study of men as leaders. We went back to the creation account and studied, at least briefly, manhood. And we identified a key element in defining manhood, and that was namely the added responsibility that God gave to men to lead. Again, it wasn't to the exclusion of women exercising their gifts or even leading in capacities, but clearly throughout Scripture we see the pattern of an added weight of responsibility given to men and for which God designed men. And then we had about a dozen men present summary studies on the various character qualities that are found in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus 1 to help us reinforce our understanding of leadership that is built on character. The world will recognize a lot of styles of leadership or strengths of leadership, such as just a position. Because you have the title, you have leadership. Personality leadership, somebody's just outgoing, a take-charge person, and so they naturally are asked to lead things. The weight of the Bible's teaching on leadership is character, godliness that becomes then influential. Now we come to our last series of studies, our class on Leadership 103, which is specifically elders as leaders. What is an elder? How does that role unfold in the Bible? What do these elders do? How do they function? So with kind of fresh eyes, I want us to look at the role of eldership so that we can clearly understand what God has designed for the local church. Obviously, keep in mind that we're speaking of the familiar language of pastors. Maybe that's more common in the context in which you grew up. But pastor and elder would be interchangeable in Scripture. Acts 20, 1 Peter 5, elder, bishop, and pastor are all used for the same office. They just highlight nuances of the role. So whether we call them elders or pastors is really not an issue at all. But understand that's what we're speaking of. I want us to, in answering the question, what does the Bible say about elders, go back to a foundational text that hopefully you're there, Exodus chapter 18, to see how the role of eldership initially unfolds for us in both civilization, but specifically the culture, the community of God's people. Exodus chapter 18, we are not far removed from the Passover, the 10 plagues, the exodus from Egypt, crossing the sea. They get to the other side of the sea, having passed through on dry land, and God drowns the Egyptian armies. That's Exodus chapter 14. Chapter 15 is the Song of Moses, where he pens this kind of anthem of celebration for what God has done. And after Moses introduces that song, it spreads through all the camps of Israel, and we're told the tambourines come out and they begin, all their Jewish song and dance around the campfires all through the probably, hundreds of thousands of Israelites. A mass celebration for this deliverance from the bondage of slavery in Egypt. Well, it's literally numbered in days later that they realize they're getting thirsty and hungry, and the complaining starts. The accusations about how lousy God is, they start to fly. Oh, if we were only back in Egypt, it was so good back there. We think of that as somewhere in the 40 years of wilderness wandering, but it was literally days after the deliverance. showing us how fickle we can be when it comes to God's blessing in our lives. Well, God provides. They begin this journey to the promised land, which should take only a couple of months, not 40 years. The Amalekites attack, and we're introduced to a young man that would play a significant role in Israel's history, Joshua, as he fights the Amalekites, while Moses is up on the mountaintop, you remember, with his hands either raised in the air or in weariness putting them down, and that determined Israel's success in battle or their failure. Well, after that account, we have Exodus chapter 18. So again, we are not even months into the wilderness. We've not yet reached Mount Sinai, no 10 Commandments yet. We're still figuring out how this is going to work, getting this mass of hundreds of thousands of people down the road and to the promised land. In Exodus 18, we are looking at this account where Moses has reunited with his father-in-law Jethro, and he recounts all that God has done. He tells all the story about life in Egypt, confrontation with Pharaoh, Pharaoh's boasts, but God's bigger boasts, and how God delivered them. Jethro celebrates with that. We have very limited knowledge, but he seems to acknowledge the primacy of the God of Israel. Verse 11, Jethro says, "Now I know that the Lord," that's Yahweh, Jehovah, "is greater than all gods, because in this affair they dealt arrogantly with the people. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. The next day, Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood around Moses from morning till evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, 'What is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone, and all the people stand around you from morning till evening?' Moses said to his father-in-law, 'Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make them know the statutes of God and his laws.' Moses' father-in-law said to him, 'What you are doing is not good.'" Well, that sets the table then for a series of principles that I want us to see regarding the leadership of a plurality, of a group of elders, leaders. And I want us to kind of highlight these ideas, but I think what I'm going to do is give you the verse, and then you try to tell me the principle that we add to the table, so to speak, as a collection of ideas to help us begin understanding all that the Bible will continue to say about leaders among God's people. So Moses, all day long, is the one guy hearing all of the issues from the people and giving all of the information from God. He's teaching the statutes and hearing all of the dilemmas that come as people try, and not always successfully, to live out those statutes. And Jethro looks at him, standing there morning to evening, dealing with all these issues, and says, essentially, "I appreciate your heart, but you're going about this the wrong way." So let's try to identify some foundational principles that would shape our understanding of elders here in Exodus 18, beginning in verse 18. Let's look at this verse, and you tell me what idea, what principle we could begin to form based on this text. Jethro says to Moses, "You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone." What's the principle here? This is an easy one. Yeah, a plurality. Surely in this crowd of all these people, there is someone else who could lend their strength to meeting the needs of the people. Surely we could structure the governance in such a way that someone could fill a role, structured. Give them a job description, give them their limitations, their boundaries, but please find some others to do some of this work. Essentially, the demands of time and energy exceeded the capacity of any one person. God doesn't need a semi-God, someone who can really just about do it all, just like God can, and so he's the guy. God's never looking to communicate that in his under-shepherds or leaders. Here we find the leader's time and ability on one hand, the needs of the multitude on the other, and they're kind of battling against each other, and it's not that anyone wins. It's a lose-lose, essentially, Jethro is saying. Nobody can win this battle. The leader can't accomplish it all and get it done, and now the people are frustrated because they have needs and they need understanding about the statutes and laws that God has given. The need was for more leaders, and so I think the first principle is one-man leadership is generally insufficient. One-man leadership is generally insufficient. Frankly, go back to the Genesis account, and God makes man and says, here's your responsibility, here's your roles, you're going to dress and keep the garden, you're going to do all these things. And then God said it's not good for the man to be alone, and he doesn't even define it strictly as, relationship. He's going to be lonely, because the word he uses to describe what he creates next is a help, a complement that serves to a fuller capacity. So even in the creation account, we realize God's plan was never for any one person in any kind of position of leadership to say, I can handle everything. Leave it to me. We don't need anyone else. One man's leadership is generally insufficient. Paul, writing to Titus in chapter 1, says, for this reason I left you, Titus, in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking. What? Appoint elders in every city as I commanded you. Paul recognized that the church was functioning, but in order to get things properly in order and set up for success, he says, you need more people. Find, develop, foster the gifts that are there. Appoint others to do the work. So one-man leadership is insufficient. Let's look at verses 19 and 20. Jethro continues, now obey my voice. I will give you advice, and God be with you. You shall represent the people before God and bring their cases to God. And you shall warn them about the statutes and the laws, and make them know the way in which they must walk and what they must do. All right, what does this tell us about leadership? What do you think? Communicating truth? Pardon? There's this role of advocacy, a go-between. What I want you to see is that these things that unfold in the text, the teaching ministry, the intercession that Moses especially will be characterized throughout his life by, these things are prioritized. They stand in contrast to what was going on a minute ago, where Moses, exhausting himself, trying to deal with all these issues that have come up, and people are starting to line up as the day goes on, and by lunchtime, the line's, 100 yards out, and Moses is doing all this stuff, and Jethro is like, listen, it's not all bad, but you have a role to fill. Your job is this, and he tells him, you represent the people before God. So you go to God on behalf of the people, and then you go to the people on behalf of God. You warn them about the statutes and laws. Teach them how they should walk and how they should live. Our principle is this: certain responsibilities must be prioritized. Jethro told Moses that he must be doing what God had called him to do. Lead the people in the broadest sense. Maybe Moses enjoyed getting into the weeds of problems and seeing the resolution and sending people away happy. It's not that it was all bad, perhaps, but his task was to represent the people to God and represent God to the people. In Acts chapter 6, we see a similar problem unfolding on the smaller scale. The apostles have this teaching ministry, which is much like the prophet Moses. And there the apostles say, we need to have more people helping. The needs are piling up and not being met. And the apostles say, not out of arrogance or not out of pride that says, well, this is below us, we're not going to serve in that way. But instead they focused on the priority. And they say, we must give ourselves continually to prayer and to the ministry of the word. Paul and the other apostles had to be discipling other leaders. They had to be preaching in cities. They were establishing these fledgling churches. That's what they were called to do. That's what they were gifted to do. And it's no more or less important than the other gifts. So let's not panic when we say there's this kind of separation of powers or separation of gifts. And the apostles say, find some men that can do these jobs so we can do these jobs. And again, it's not out of pride or out of something's more important. It's simply the recognition that God has equipped all kinds of people in the body, and so let's prioritize the responsibilities God has given to us, and then if there's room for a few other things, great. But in this case, Moses was misstepping by thinking he had to do all that. Prioritize your responsibilities, and inevitably this is going to open the door to help, to others, to a team concept. Our pride doesn't often let us do this. We don't know if Moses was proud or just kind of ignorant. This was a learning curve. He hadn't overseen hundreds of thousands of people before. He was generally tending sheep who may have been prone to wander like people, and yet it was a different crowd. So this was a learning curve. And what Moses was learning was to ask the question, what has God called me to do? And if there are other weaknesses I have, then maybe there are other people who can help in those areas. All right, number 3, let's look at verse 21. Moreover, Jethro continues, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, men who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. A couple of principles that we'll take from just this one verse. What ideas come to your mind? Integrity and character. That's one of our principles. Qualifications govern the selection of leaders. In this verse, it's somewhat abbreviated. Men who fear God, who are trustworthy, and hate a bribe. We could probably draw lines all the way to the New Testament list of character qualities and find something similar. Men who aren't lovers of money, not going to be influenced by it. That's not most important. Men who fear God, that's pretty broad. Trustworthy, that'd be the respectability that unfolds in the qualifications. So qualifications govern the selection of leaders. Now I remind you, it's not because leaders should have better character than everyone else. Like the expectation is we all have godly character. Everyone in Israel should fear God, be trustworthy, and hate a bribe. But if you're going to be put in a leadership role, then certainly look at these qualifications and see how are they doing in these areas. But our minds generally drift towards, well, if they have to be that, that's only for leadership. And somehow we think there's a lower bar. That's not the case. It's asking us all to be striving for godliness. And when you're looking for leaders, you want to be looking for someone who's doing the striving. They may not be perfect, but they are striving. They are aware of what God requires and are pressing toward that mark. So we clearly see that qualifications govern the selection of leaders. We see that in 1 Timothy 3, in Titus 1, as the men presented. And let me again just highlight that Acts 6 account of finding leaders that in the search the apostles were undertaking. And there, again, it's a very short description of what was being sought after. The apostles tell the men, choose out 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom. And that's all they're told. General character qualities, general spiritual mindset. Broad terms that allow for all the qualifications that unfold in 1 Timothy 3. But it strikes us with a certain level of simplicity that makes the pursuit of leaders not like mysterious or, man, this is going to be really challenging. There's something of an eye test right there in Acts chapter 6 in that brevity. Same thing in Acts 18. By 1 Timothy 3, it's a little bit more of a on-paper evaluation almost. It's like, here's a list of like a dozen or more qualities. But don't miss the eye test of Exodus 18 and Acts 6, that you should generally know someone and think, yeah, I mean, they'd probably make a good leader in the church. You may not know everything about them, but generally you would conclude, oh yeah, they're trying to walk in the Spirit. They honor the Lord. They're trying to do it right. That's something. That's like, there's a balance here. The Bible gives us Exodus 18 and Acts 6, and it's almost like, hey, look around and find the men who seem to be this. And then there is the added weight of 1 Timothy and Titus 1, where it just says, okay, having looked around and generally identified some men, maybe just take a little closer look and make sure of these things. And then the word is appoint them, put them to work. So there is a simplicity in the scriptures about it, but it's also under this umbrella of God is doing his work in his church, and by the Holy Spirit, we should make wise choices. So there's a great responsibility, but don't make it a great mystery. Qualifications govern the selection of leaders. What else can we conclude from this verse, though? Moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place such men over the people, as chiefs of thousands, hundreds, fifties, tens. Yeah, it's the exact phrase I want us to hit, that from all the people. Certainly there's a place for the concept of developing leaders, developing men, developing character in men and women, developing godliness in the church. But don't miss that from the people. Like, it's there to remind us, just as Acts 6 says, brothers, search out men from among you. Like, these are the people you know. What do you see in them? Would you trust that person to sit in a council of men and make some decisions and wrestle through hard issues? And if your first response is, yeah, I think I would, then that's kind of what we're on to. Jethro tells Moses, search out these able men from all the people. They're there. They're there. They may not be perfect. They may need continued discipleship. But as we're going to see, Moses needs continued discipleship. Joshua is going to need discipleship. He's going to be asked to lead these people eventually after years of assisting Moses, and he's terrified. He doesn't want to do it. We always pick on Moses for being a chicken when God came to him and said, you're going to lead these people. Well, when he asked Joshua, who he thinks this great warrior, 4 times in one chapter, he's told, be strong and of a good courage, because he's ready to turn tail and run. So leaders need discipleship. So let's stop thinking that potential leaders don't need discipleship. They should be perfect, and that's why we're choosing them to be leaders. It's not the case. Yes, men who generally are meeting the qualifications of godliness, but not men who are perfect and aren't going to need continued development. From among the people, there they are, Moses. Look around you. Who do you see that would capably be able to do some of those things that you're wearing yourself out trying to do? And I have to think Moses, in the coming weeks and months, sat back and marveled at the number of men who could do what he was doing and maybe do it even better. So leadership is sought from among the people. Qualifications govern the selection of leaders. Now, a couple of more principles from verse 22. And let them judge the people at all times. Every great matter they shall bring to you, but any small matter they shall decide themselves. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, God will direct you, you will be able to endure, and all this people also will go to their place in peace. All right, what do you see in these couple of verses? We're looking towards results and outcomes. So what do you see there? Yeah. It'll be easier for you, Jethro tells Moses. They will bear the burden with you. So, as current elders, looking to include more leaders in our group, we love this kind of verse. It'll be easier for you. The load gets spread out. You've just added a couple of piers, or supports to maybe a sagging deck off the back porch. The span was too long, and so it sagged a little, and you got to get in there and jack up another post. Well, you just spread the weight out over more so that now no few posts are holding all the weight. It'll be easier for you. They will bear the burden with you. So multiple leaders actually serve other leaders. It makes the general task of leadership more bearable. Now, there's grace for what God calls us to. Grace even for specifically ministry, Paul would write about. But sometimes we go about the nuts and bolts structure of leadership without the wisdom that the Bible has given us. And here it's really practical. Spread that weight out over more support. Let leaders serve each other. All right, what's another result we see? Yeah, multiple leaders serve the people. Yeah, we get it. It's easier for the few leaders that are overwhelmed, add more, and not only do you add more perspective and wisdom, but just more yoke or more oxen to pull that yoke. But even the greater result is that they are judging the people at all times. The great matters are being resolved. The small matters are being resolved. He goes on to say, you will be able to endure. Yes, it will be easier for you. But also, the end of 23, the people will go to their place in peace. This is the great hope. This is our study in Philippians. This joyful Christian life, which should lead us to unity. We can get along with others. We can, as we'll study again this morning, follow the example of Christ, who humbled himself and served others. And that brings about unity. The people will go to their place in peace. The conflicts are resolved. Needs are being met. No one's being put off. And, we'll try to get to that eventually. And Moses is too busy for you right now. And they're offended. Well, how come my problem's not as important as that? All that stuff was brewing. And in a smaller way in Acts 6, needs were stewing and people were getting upset. And in both cases, the solution was, hey, we just need more people to exercise their gifts and serve the body. And so in these coming weeks and months, as we continue to talk about the final steps that are moving us closer to even evaluating specific men as leaders, you can be prayerfully considering, prayerfully seeking, asking God for the results that the text indicates here in Exodus 18 and there in Acts chapter 6. That matters, small or great, would be taken care of, that leaders wouldn't be exhausted and taxed beyond capacity, and that the body, the people, would be able to experience peace, unity, rest. So Exodus 18, while kind of just this insight into this kind of conversation between two men, recorded for us by God so that we would understand something about leadership in the church, which wouldn't come till 1,500 years after this account. So this is foundational. These are kind of just like hints to how we would administrate the roles of pastor and deacon in a church that would come about all the years later. But it does show us some ancient wisdom. And God records it for us, not only in its practice, in the details of it, men literally over a few families, tens, and then 50s, and then hundreds, and then thousands. So we see the scale and the hierarchy. We see the process where if it's not resolved at the lower level, it can be kind of passed along the chain. You would do this in the workplace. If you and your immediate manager can't figure it out, you might call in the regional manager or something. We understand how that works, and it's all here for us. The nuts and bolts, and also those end results, where we see what wisdom leads to, where we see what submission to God-ordained authority leads to. So foundational principles. Now, I want us to just briefly think through the coming years post-wilderness, beginning with the law that's given, and then the experience of the Jewish people, the Israelites, for the next, millennium. What was the mindset of Jewish culture? By the time we get to the New Testament in the book of Acts, what is this Jewish mind regarding authority that so enabled them to hear the apostles say, the way we're going to run the church is to have elders? Why was that such a natural transition that is never balked at? No one blinks an eye. It just, of course, that's what we would do. And I think it's just an understanding of the Jewish culture beginning here in Exodus 18, when a family, basically, the descendants of Jacob, were being shaped because of their size into what would become essentially a nation, a people, a culture, a community. In the Jewish culture, the mention of elders clearly refers to this plurality of men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, who are asked to oversee, to lead. They would lead in civic matters, eventually religious matters, certainly in personal matters and conflicts. At the time of Moses, elders represent the population. It's the simplest conclusion in reading through the beginning chapters of Exodus. Even before Exodus 18, elders are talked about. Exodus chapter 3, God's speaking to Moses in his call to ministry, and he tells him, I'm going to send you to talk to the elders. So Moses is in the wilderness, burning bush, called to deliver the people. God sends him back to Egypt, where he's not going to go house to house and visit every Israelite family and tell them he's going to lead them out of Egypt. No, he's going to go to the elders. In chapter 4, he does that, and he even demonstrates the signs that God gave him. Likely the same signs that God showed him in the wilderness that he would show Pharaoh, that throwing his stick down and it becomes a serpent, and taking it back up again, it becomes a stick. Putting his hand inside his vest and it comes out leprous, and does it again and it's healed. But he shows that sign, those signs to those elders, the representatives of all the tribes and families. Because that's how God was beginning to establish how he's going to communicate with and deal with his people through a group of leaders. In Exodus 12, the Passover is explained not to every family, but through the elders who would then go and communicate to the families. In Exodus 17, God tells Moses to take some of the elders with him to strike the rock, which would provide water for the whole crowd. We remember the story. Moses is called to strike the rock, but we forget that God wanted several of the elders there as well to represent both the authority that Moses had, but also then to communicate what God had done to all the people. When Moses receives the law from God, it incorporates these community leaders, these elders, into the administration of the law that God reveals. Deuteronomy would call these leaders elders. And the word generally was used of the leaders because they were older or elder. They were guys who had been around the block a few times, had a few gray hairs at least, had some experience, had demonstrated some wisdom. Now again, by the New Testament, the word elder is still used, and yet Paul is also telling one of his elders, Timothy, don't let anyone despise your youth. So immediately we realize, okay, in the New Testament, whatever continuity there is with eldership, there is some discontinuity that it doesn't have to be just 60-year-olds. There can be youthfulness, even in our culture, that we would think of as 30s and 40s. Some of you look back on that and say, yeah, that definitely seems like youth to what I feel in my body these days. So the New Testament elder doesn't have to be a young person, nor does it have to be an old person. It's borrowing from the cultural term, but even Timothy is told, listen, I know you might not think of yourself in the cultural term as an elder, but that's what you're going to serve as because of your experience, because of your wisdom, because of your character in the church. So the Mosaic Law incorporated elders. They would be responsible for solving murders. Somebody was found dead, the elders of the city would be brought in to figure out what had happened. Sometimes it was an accidental death, so the elders were responsible to administrate retrieving someone from a city of refuge to which they had fled so that the family wouldn't seek revenge on them. And the elders with judges would determine what would be the next steps of action. You remember it was the elders who would deal with disobedient children in the extreme, not in the everyday application of bringing them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, but in the broad cases of rebellion against the parents. The elders would decide on the outcome and the punishment for those children. Centuries later, elders are still leading cities in Israel after the return from Babylon. Ezra chapter 10. Please let the leaders of our entire assembly stand, and let all those in our cities who have taken wives, pagan wives, come at appointed times and meet with the elders and judges of their cities until the fierce wrath of our God is turned away from us in this matter. Ezra tells the people, listen, because you've intermarried with the pagan culture, we need to deal with this, so come before the elders and the judges. And so all through the Old Testament, elders overseeing civic, religious, personal conflicts that arise. By the time we get to what we call our New Testament, the gospel accounts, Jesus has taken on human flesh, and there he's carrying out his teaching ministry. That's in our New Testament Bible, but remember, that's Old Testament life, right? They're still living under the old covenant. So that's a good glimpse, even in the Gospels, of what Old Testament Jewish mindset really is. And in Luke 7, we read the account of the Roman centurion whose servant was sick. Luke 7:1. Now when Jesus concluded all his sayings in the hearings of the people, he entered Capernaum. And a certain centurion's servant, who was dear to him, was sick and ready to die. So when he heard about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. The Roman recognized how Jewish culture works, and he leaned on the elders of the city to represent him in this request. The Sanhedrin that we read of in the New Testament was a ruling body of 70 elders, which they believed was begun in Numbers chapter 11, verse 16. There we read, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and officers over them, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand there with you.'" So going all the way back to the Pentateuch, the 5 books of the law, the Jews in Jesus' day, well, a few hundred years before that, had settled on this number of 70 from the account of Moses as a good council, as a good senate, to use the Roman term, of leaders that would together work to resolve the issues of the land. That was functioning, obviously, in Jesus' day. That's the account of Jesus' trial. They're at work in the trial of Paul as well. So with that backdrop of now 1,500 years of leadership by elders, it's not difficult to see how this structure of authority would be accepted by the Jews as the plan for leadership in the church. In our culture, it's not much different. For us, it's normal for a corporation to be governed by what we would call a board of directors. Therefore, it wasn't uncommon in the last 50 years of the American church for the governing bodies in the church to be called either a board of elders or pastors or a board of deacons. It was simply recognizing that our culture knows what authority looks like in a group of people. A board of directors in the business world, and so the church thought, well, that's kind of what we want in the church, that collective group working together. For the Jewish mind, one word summarized leadership, and it was elders. That's all they had known, other than kings and prophets that had a specific role. But the general leadership was the leadership of elders. So in the next couple of studies, we want to take a look at how God takes that concept of civic leadership and really kind of converts it to spiritual leadership in the church for the sake of his body, the church. Again, eldership is not a denominational term, though it has been more distinct in certain denominations. It's a simple Bible term. Pastor or elder, bishop, overseer. All these terms are used for what the Jew, the first foundations of the church, would have known as the elders, the leaders in the community. And in this local community of believers at Grace Bible Church, we are simply pursuing the Lord's will for those other gifts that would spread out the work and make peace for this congregation. So Lord, would you help us to that end? The beautiful exercise of Spirit-empowered gifts, the strong influence of godly character, the wisdom that is brought to bear for the good of our families. Would you bring about a greater discipleship and a greater mindset for your kingdom because of the influence of godly men who would lead this congregation? Walk us through these coming weeks and months, and may we soon come to that sunrise, that outcome of peace, of work accomplished, of vision implemented, of needs being met, simply because we see in your word the pattern for what the church should be. May our church always be a reflection of the truth of your word and of your good work through Jesus Christ among us. For it's in his name we pray. Amen.